Good evening, everybody. Thanks for coming out. We're going to go ahead and get started here. My name is Ryan Wiesdock, and I'm the chair of the Greens at Virginia Tech. Dr. Smith is a visiting assistant professor of mathematics at Hampton-Sydney College, and I think you're going to be very fascinated by what he has to say. So without further ado, Dr. Smith.
Thank you, Ryan. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Good evening. My talks don't usually come with a warning label, but I think tonight maybe I'd better offer just a couple of little warnings. First of all, I have a tremendous amount I want to tell you. Guess I better stay here. A tremendous amount I want to tell you, and I mean to do it in an hour, so I'm going to stick pretty close to my written remarks, and you may feel at times as though you're trying to drink from a fire hose, and I hope you're all seated comfortably. The second warning I want to give is that some of the things that I have to tell you might induce some feelings of anxiety. So kind of like when the doctor says, this procedure might cause some discomfort, I think it's fair to give you that heads up because it helps to squelch the freak-out reflex, right? My purpose is not to make you feel anxious or negative at all. My purpose, in fact, is to have you leave here feeling optimistic about the dawn of a new human future. But we can't get to the dawn until we've gone through the dark night. And it doesn't help us at all if we go chasing after the fading light of the day that's coming to an end. So with that, I'll go ahead and kind of get going here. So the political humorist Frank Reed wrote that a leper is happiest when he knows why his fingers are falling off. Now, my own encounters with adversity aren't that fraught, but they do lead me to suspect that this is true. And assuming that it is, it's an easy corollary that if we're really going to enjoy the end of the world, whatever that means, then we should seek the best insights available into what's happened and what is happening and what is going to happen. But we do have a problem because the world has been ending off and on for almost all of recorded human history. Such insights are already too numerous. One or another version of the end is nigh has been a hit with nearly every generation, and each version has brought with it a narrative of what fundamentally is wrong and usually why it can't be fixed. Some people take comfort in the sheer number and historical variety of the prophecies of doom, supposing that if they've been wrong about it up to now, after all, we're still here, then we can probably relax and assume we'll still be here tomorrow. But this attitude overlooks the frequency with which the end really has arrived. In fact, it always does arrive. Every great and small civilization before our own has ended one way or another. And some of those endings were abrupt and terrifying. It would be simple-minded to assume that we're special. But the problem remains. We have too many insights into what will cause this civilization, this civilization to crash. From Malthusians and millenarians to climate scientists and political and economic doomsayers, explanations for our present crises and likely ruin lie thick about us. Our first task, then, is to find a higher vantage, to pull the camera back in a kind of dolly zoom, keeping the subject of collapse near and clear while at the same time broadening our field of view to its natural limit. We may ask, what is a civilization? How does one come to be? How does it come not to be? Are there any general principles we should be aware of? What analogs exist in nature that illustrate these principles? What about examples from history? The most general class of things of which civilizations are an example is termed by scientists dissipative structures. Other examples of dissipative structures include living things like you and me, organized things like anthills and corporations, and many natural phenomena such as the sun, a forest fire, and hurricanes. What each of these things has in common is that they rely on an available flow of useful energy to maintain themselves. Once a flux of useful energy is no longer available, self-maintenance fails, and the dissipative structure dissolves. The word for self-maintenance in this context is homeostasis, and the word for energy that's available for use by a dissipative structure is exergy. For instance, when a fire is sparked in the presence of a fuel source, The fire will grow until it is consuming the fuel as quickly as it can, and it will continue to burn until the fuel is exhausted. At that point, quickly or slowly, the fire dies and ceases to exist. The energy that was contained in the fuel still exists, but it's no longer exergy. As chemical energy, it was available to a process, the fire, that used it to grow and maintain itself. But that process dissipated the energy as diffused heat. It will never again be used to maintain a dissipative structure. The energy remains, but the exergy is gone. One can view the entire universe as a dissipative structure. In the beginning was the Big Bang, an explosive emergence of pure exergy that created time and space and all the stuff. Over the last 14 or so billion years, the exergy has been gradually dissipating as the universe expands and cools. Eventually, it is believed, it will end in heat death, a state in which there remains no exergy at all. The feature that is perhaps most characteristic of dissipative structures, including the universe itself, is their complexity. Complexity is a puzzling phenomenon. At least it puzzled me, and it often still does, in part because it appears to violate the laws of physics. In particular, the second law of thermodynamics states that in a closed system, entropy always increases. This principle says that order is never spontaneously produced from disorder. You can shatter the glass, but you can't unshatter it. You can't unburn the fuel, unwither the flower, unscatter the dandelion seeds. Once Humpty Dumpty falls, there's no putting him back together. But complexity, which is an apparent increase in order, arises spontaneously within dissipative structures. How can this be? It's because of rules. That is, it's owing to the fact that energy can only flow in accordance with rules. In purely physical processes, like a burning fire, the rules are those of physics and chemistry, what are called physical laws. But any dissipative structure is the same in this respect. It dissipates energy from exergy into heat, and it does so in a manner that conforms to the laws that govern its nature. Rules give us complexity. In 1970, mathematician John Conway introduced what he called his game of life. It had nothing to do with the Milton Bradley game of the same name. This was an example of a type of mathematical model called cellular automata. It consists of a board laid out on a square grid. One is to imagine that this grid extends indefinitely far in all directions. The squares are called cells, and they may be either empty or colored in. In the simplest version, there's only one color, and a cell that is colored is said to be alive, and one that is empty is said to be dead. The rules are simple. If a dead cell has exactly 3 live neighbors among its 8 adjacent squares, then it comes alive in the next turn. A live cell with 2 or 3 neighbors stays alive. A live cell with more than 3 or fewer than 2 neighbors dies. In the example shown up here is a pattern that repeats itself every 4 turns, but which shifts down and to the right as it does so. This is called a walker, because it just kind of moves along across the thing over and over and over, repeating the same pattern. A pattern like this in Conway's game of life is a dissipative structure. In order for cells to change at each turn, calculations must be made and the board updated. This costs exergy. In the case of this particular example, it's in the form of electricity flowing through circuits. No electricity, no game. But the reason it's interesting for this discussion is because it illustrates beautifully how complexity arises in dissipative structures. Start off any board with a few randomly colored squares and let it run. And there's no knowing what you might end up with. Most of the time, it doesn't do much. The cells either all die or fall into some repeating pattern. But occasionally, something curious happens. Sometimes, very intricate patterns are created. Sometimes these patterns grow, or move about while maintaining their structure, or even reproduce themselves, or procreate other patterns that in turn have interesting properties. In this brief looping animation here, the little white specks are the live cells on a grid that's almost too small to see, and the patterns are produced as several dozen turns are calculated in the space of a second or so. Recently, it was learned that a programmable computer can be made as a game of life pattern, and indeed there appears to be no limit to the complexity of systems that can arise, all from the bare handful of rules that govern how energy is expressed as it flows through the structure. Watching the patterns emerge gives one the uncanny sense of something actually alive. It should be noted that the amount of exergy required to produce the patterns is not constant. Efficiently programmed, any given instantiation of the game of life makes only as many calculations as are required for each turn. A pattern that grows in size and varies continuously will require an ever greater number of calculations at each stage. These calculations cost exergy. The circuitry of the computer will actually draw more electricity and create more heat in consequence. This is a theme we'll have cause to revisit. One more note, the large and complex patterns that are sometimes created are almost always exceedingly fragile. Introduce a few live cells in the midst of such a pattern, and it will usually fall into pieces, consumed as if by a destroying fire of random interactions. The vulnerability and fragility of homeostasis is another theme that will echo in what follows. So we've noted the following commonalities. All dissipative structures consume energy, transforming useful energy, what we've called exergy, into less useful energy, heat, basically. All dissipative structures give rise to complexity. That is, they're self-organizing as an emergent property of the way their inherent rules channel their energy flows. To these principles, we should now add a third. It's been noted that even the universe itself, considered as a dissipative structure, will not go on forever. Eventually, it will suffer heat death, at which point there will be no remaining structure or complexity of any kind. It follows that no dissipative structure is immortal. The first risk to any dissipative structure is variation in its flux of energy. Of course, if the fuel dries up, it's done for, but we'll see that for highly complex structures, it may be enough just for the flux to vary too much to cause a loss of homeostasis. But there are other dangers. Like a match in the wind, every dissipative structure has an external environment that can act upon it. And these actions can produce crises that also threaten homeostasis. The more complex the structure, the more different kinds of crises can occur. Moreover, as complexity increases, the more likely it becomes that a crisis in one aspect of the system will cause cascading crises in other parts of the system. So, suppose for sake of argument that a dissipative structure doesn't run out of fuel and isn't adversely impacted by any externalities. Can it go on indefinitely? In general, no, because dissipative structures are never static, and they never go backwards. No natural process is reversible in itself because entropy always increases, never spontaneously decreases. The same processes that bring a dissipative structure into being must continue because energy must continue to flow, introducing new complexities. Each increase in complexity has a metabolic cost, that is, a maintenance cost, that also continues. As these costs accumulate, eventually the system becomes unsustainable on its energy base and increasingly fragile, and at some point a crisis occurs and there's a complexity collapse. If exergy is still available post-collapse, then it will arise anew, typically with significant variations from the old structure. The biologist Eugene Odum, who wrote the first American textbook on ecology, described how this process occurs in ecosystems. He termed it succession, and it's defined by three properties. It's an orderly process of community development. It results from modification of the physical environment by the community. And it culminates in a homeostatic ecosystem in which maximum biomass and symbiotic function between organisms are maintained. Maximum, that is, per unit of energy flow. Nature always optimizes. To repeat, self-organization is directed towards achieving as large and diverse an organic structure as possible within the limits set by the available energy input and the prevailing physical conditions. Once homeostasis is achieved, the ecosystem is mature. However, eventually the ecosystem succumbs to its own fragility. A small perturbation in climate, or a fire, or the evolution of a disruptive or invasive or parasitic species, and all the intricate specializations that led to optimization of the ecosystem structure become, in turn, the cause of the system's failure. In the long view, this is not a tragedy, but an essential component of the evolutionary process. It's precisely the story of life on this planet, with its breathtaking diversity, not only across continents, but across time. Notice that in odom succession, no organism controls or directs the ecosystem's development. Each organism behaves in accordance with its own nature, affecting and affected by the other organisms, yet the result is a tightly integrated system in which each organism depends for its own existence on the system as a whole. When the system fails, the individual organisms mostly die. All right, so that's a lot of analogies. What about civilization as dissipative structures? Humans had no civilization until about 20,000 years ago, despite having a rich trove of cultural artifacts dating back at least 50,000 years. Hunter-gatherers have to spend nearly all their energy, everything they can acquire from their environment, on acquiring that very energy. Most animals, prehistoric humans included, spend most of the energy they get from food on the task of acquiring more food. The ratio of the totality of energy acquired to the energy cost of acquiring that energy is called EROI, for energy return on investment. For living things, it's generally always between 1 and 2. That is, the energy they must spend getting energy is not a lot more than the energy they get. Less than 1 means starvation. Closer to 2 means further growth and development is possible, since there's excess energy available for it. The EROI on hunting-gathering is between 1 and 2, just high enough to permit maintenance of a kinship group, reproduction, and the fashioning of a few implements and decorations. The cultural sophistication can be impressive, but the level of social complexity is essentially 0. There's only enough excess energy for the complexity shown here. No intermediate levels of authority between the lowest and the highest ranked members, very little specialization, and only limited forms of interaction with other groups. It wasn't until around 12,000 years ago, when humans first started to domesticate both animals and plants, that their EROI increased sufficiently to allow a burst in social complexity. Population sizes also expanded. In fact, population seems to always closely track energy return on investment. Agricultural communities were able to store and process food in greater quantities, creating enough excess energy that some could be spent on dwellings, complex tools, and increasing specialization, including roles not directly involved in food production, that is to say, in energy acquisition. As farming techniques improved and more productive breeds and plants of plants and animals were cultivated, EROI rose as high as 4 or so. Not only were all the present needs met with plenty to spare, but embodied energy in the form of preserved food and tradable goods could be accumulated. This development introduced 2 new wrinkles. First, it was very common for a community to overexploit an agricultural area, resulting in reduced yields over time, what's called diminishing returns, and that results in a reduced EROI. Second, successful communities were an inviting target for raiders. These features play a significant role in the next leap in complexity, from agricultural communities to agriculture-based empires. Ancient empires were built on centralized control of agricultural regions, control that was acquired through conquest. When one society conquers another, the conqueror gets a huge boost to their energy return on investment, because the accumulated wealth of the conquered society, its excess food and goods, can be pillaged outright. And if the conquered remain conquered, they can be taxed. In this way, the ancient empires often grew quite large, and some lasted for many centuries or more. With their excess energy, empires grew socially very complex, with administrative, military, religious, and economic sectors, each with its own hierarchies and technicians. The number of intermediaries between the lowest and highest ranked members of society was large, and the number of social roles exploded. In addition to trading and war, relations between societies could be diplomatic and involve cultural exchange. However, every ancient empire suffered a similar fate. Once the surrounding societies are conquered and pillaged, they have to be administered and garrisoned. That soaks up a lot of excess energy. Each new campaign stretches lines of supply and control farther than before. Diminishing returns set in, and the EROI declines. To compensate for the loss of energy while maintaining homeostasis, taxes are increased, typically in the form of an ever greater share of agricultural output from vassals. This leads inexorably to resource depletion, and finally, the weakened empire is itself conquered, or simply falls to pieces. The case of Rome is especially instructive. They were very, very good at being an empire, and were able to hold off collapse for a long time. But ultimately, every step they took to avoid collapse ensured that when the collapse occurred, it would be complete. Rome squeezed its agricultural and human resource base for every drop of energy, with the result that when the Western Empire finally collapsed in the face of determined attacks from the frontier, the drop in social complexity, in population, and in political and cultural stability was extreme and lasted for nearly 500 years. Call it the Dark Ages, right? There was no resource base left in the form of fertile soil, harvestable forests, and stable human communities from which to rebuild. Okay, so further developments in energy capture were pretty limited before the Industrial Age. There were innovations like the capture of mechanical wind power, enabling, for instance, the flourishing of the Dutch Empire in the 16th century, other seagoing empires, but nothing that increased EROI much above 5 or so. But with the invention of the heat engine in the 18th century and of fossil fuels to produce the heat, everything changed. Coal and later oil provided an energy return on investment of up to 100. 1 unit of energy in, 100 units of energy out, making almost limitless energy available to drive social development of every kind. Global per capita energy use rose exponentially, quadrupling by the year 2000, even as the global population increased by more than 7-fold. The result is what we have today: a globalized, industrialized, fully integrated economy with massive energy and information flows, in which the level of connectivity within and between groups is so high that the complexity rivals anything previously imagined or imaginable. To put our per capita energy use in expensive, consider that a healthy adult can sustain about 75 watts of work for 8 hours, an 8-hour day. That's about 600 watt-hours of work, 0.6 of a kilowatt. If you had 10 slaves, they could perform 6 kilowatt-hours of work for you in a workday. Rather less than you get from a single gallon of gasoline used in a typical car engine. The gallon of gasoline can propel an automobile 30 miles in 30 minutes. How long would it take you to push your car 30 miles? How many friends would you need to help you? An average American consumer, directly and indirectly, uses enough energy daily to perform the work of hundreds of slaves. These energy slaves are what make global industrial civilization possible. It's an almost universal conceit, you know, that our present level of social complexity is largely owing to our cleverness, right? It's because we're clever. But the accumulation of technical and theoretical knowledge, you know, up to the 18th century, that certainly was important. It was a fundamental ingredient in what came after. But the explosion of economic and population growth, technical advancement, and social complexity from 1800 to the present could not have occurred without the huge excess energy that fossil fuels provided. With an early return on investment of 50 to 100, that energy permitted the overwhelming majority of the population to redirect their activity away from agriculture and energy acquisition to an ever-expanding array of other social specialties. And this in turn accelerated further innovation by orders of magnitude. Now, however, as you're probably aware, we face some challenges. First of all, our civilization is designed for very high energy flows. And the quantity of fossil fuel remaining on Earth is declining. The less fossil fuel that remains, the more it costs to exploit it. There are no substitutable energy sources that have a similar energy return on investment. I'll unpack substitutable here in just a few minutes. Our non-energy resource base, minerals, water, arable land, and so on, is also dwindling. And the ecological basis of any future low energy return on investment civilization is being destroyed. In short, we're falling off what's been termed the energy cliff. An energy return on investment of 100 means that 99% of the 99% of the energy accumulated can be diverted to uses other than getting more energy. An EROI of 20 means that 95% is available for use, so there isn't much practical difference between an energy return on investment of 100 and an EROI of 20. But after that, things get worse very quickly. And an energy return on investment of 5 means that only 80% of the energy is available for other uses. When oil was first exploited as a fuel source, the EROI was roughly 100. As the oil economy grew, both institutional and physical infrastructures had to be built for it. For example, paved roads. And these metabolic costs decreased the energy return on investment to 30 or so. As the richest and easiest to exploit deposits were exhausted, more had to be spent to exploit deposits that were smaller and harder to reach and of lower quality. By the start of the 21st century, the average energy return on investment, it's hard to say that over and over, isn't it, of conventional oil had dropped to 20. And the energy return on investment of newly exploited deposits of conventional oil is now 10 or less. Wind and solar are now competitive with oil at the point of generation. But if the electricity they produce has to be stored, the EROI drops to barely more than 1. Unconventional oil sources have an EROI of no more than 5, possibly much less. And the pace of diminishing returns is much quicker for those than with conventional oil. Biomass has turned out to be a bust from an EROI perspective, and agricultural land is becoming far too precious to waste on it. The difference between an EROI of 20 and one of 5 is more significant than it might appear. Established economies have a metabolic cost. Existing infrastructure has to be serviced and replaced. Existing institutions have to be funded. Existing populations have to be fed and clothed and housed and transported. A decline of 5% can mean the difference between meeting these costs with enough left over for further development or not meeting these costs, which means the civilization must cannibalize its reserves, and fragility and eventually collapse ensues. So how might we avoid falling off the energy cliff? So here are some ideas that people have, right? We could just start exploiting the existing energy resources at a faster rate, right? Because, if you're only getting 80% back, then exploit that much more to make up the difference. You could try to use the existing resources more efficiently. Or maybe you can make the existing economic and social orders less energy intensive, so they need less energy. And of course, you want to try to find new energy sources to replace the existing ones. Unfortunately, what we're going to see here is that none of these options is actually available. Consider exploiting fossil energy at a faster rate. So, conventional oil and gas production peaked globally about 10 years ago. In the United States, it peaked about 40 years ago. And it can't be economically increased because the cost of expanding the drilling and refining infrastructure to increase throughput can never be recovered by the value of the remaining oil. We could increase coal, but only at severe environmental cost, even before climate change is considered. And that supply, too, will peak before very long. Shale oil recovered through fracking already has too low an EROI to make it profitable to extract. This is kind of an open secret in the financial press. I don't know if you've been following, but there's a $250 billion investment in oil shale and gas fracking that these pipelines are being built for. None of these companies has ever made any money. It's just huge debt bubble. Anyway, and they have a devastating ecological cost, of course. Continuing to release greenhouse gases at our present rate, let alone an accelerating rate, puts the planet on track to cross climate tipping points, possibly within a decade, that will probably result in near-term global extinction of most life, including us. And carbon capture and sequestration technology and so-called negative emissions technologies, not only are they unproven, but they'll reduce the energy return on investment to 1 or less if we implement them on a wide scale. Okay, what about increasing efficiency? Well, we've already dramatically increased efficiency, right? Buildings are better insulated, lighting and other appliances are more efficient. We're all switching to LEDs. Gas and diesel engines are much more efficient. I have a truck, it gets 20 miles per gallon on the highway. Don't worry, I don't drive it much. But the one that I had, or I should say that my dad had many years ago, that got 12 miles to the gallon, so that's a big improvement. But for every efficiency introduced, the rate of consumption has increased, not decreased. This is called the Jevons paradox, and it's an observable feature of natural economies. In the absence of forced rationing, efficiency always increases rather than decreases the rate of consumption. Also, increasing efficiency requires the development of new technologies, new kinds of motors and devices, new lighting technologies, and so on. New technologies require research and prototyping and then capitalization in the marketplace, and each of these steps demands an energy budget. And there are diminishing returns on innovation, so that each new increment of technical progress requires more energy on average than the ones that came before. And the rate of increase is exponential. I mean, think about the inventors in the early 20th century, Edison and Tesla and so on and so forth. They were grabbing the low-hanging fruit, right? If you look at the, back in the record, this is something that Tainter did when he did his business on the collapse of complex societies. Look back in the patent office records, and you'll see that there were a lot of patents given to individual inventors, individual researchers. That almost never happens anymore because those easy-to-get innovations have been gotten. Not only has the rate of new patents slowed down, but the size of the teams and their budget that get those new patents, that's exploded. It takes a well-researched department of a dozen people to come close to finding a new patentable technology. So that's diminishing returns. What about making the existing economic and social orders less energy intensive? Well, as we noted, efficiency isn't going to do it. And really, we can't achieve much beyond the efficiency we've already achieved. More people could insulate their homes, but that's about as good as it gets. Consequently, the only way to make the economy use less energy is to unwind its complexity. And this is impossible to do in a deliberate fashion. I'll explore the reasons why after dealing with alternative energy sources. So here they are. There's actually only 4 primary sources of energy on Earth: solar, tidal, nuclear, and geothermal. Fossil fuel isn't an energy source. Fossil fuel is an energy carrier. Basically a big battery that the sun charged up over hundreds of millions of years and which we've now drained. The battery can be recharged, but only on geological timescales. So for human purposes, once we've drained it, that's it. Geothermal energy has not been exploited up to now in any meaningful way because the engineering challenges are too great to make it economical. Tidal energy, which is caused by the relative motions of the Earth, Moon, and Sun, and Albert Einstein, has likewise not been exploited for the same reason. Nuclear energy, in principle, is ideal. It's the old thing about, in theory there's no difference between theory and practice, but in practice there is. It produces almost unlimited electricity at what ought to be manageable cost, but it hasn't turned out that way. Because of the cost of building and decommissioning fission nuclear plants, and because of the enormous risks they represent, no nuclear plant has ever stood on its own economically. It has always had to rely on subsidies, especially indemnities. And inevitably, the disasters occur. Few nations are pursuing this option anymore, and most plants will go out of commission within a few decades, hopefully in a controlled manner. Nuclear fusion wouldn't have many of these problems, but that technology has been feasible in just a few years since I was in high school 40 years ago. I wouldn't hold my breath. All right, so that leaves all the many manifestations of solar energy. Wind generators, the wind is driven by the sun and the Coriolis effect, and photovoltaics and biomass, which of course is sun energy, photosynthesis. Of these, only biomass can be used to create liquid fuels and other hydrocarbons like plastics. And this is our Achilles heel. This is it. Because liquid fuels are not directly substitutable from an economic or engineering standpoint by any quantity of electricity. Remember that gallon of gas? It weighs 6 pounds. It can be carried in a cheap plastic container, and it's ready right now to push your 1-ton vehicle 30 miles down the road in 30 minutes. The equivalent amount of electricity can be generated for about the same price. But by the time it's gotten into your vehicle and made ready for use, its cost has increased significantly. And that's not including the several $1,000 cost of your several hundred pounds of batteries to store it until you need it, batteries that have to be replaced every few years. Those batteries, in turn, require large amounts of an element, lithium, which is presently cheap and fairly abundant, but which is extremely expensive to recycle. There's about enough of it in known reserves to replace the entire fleet of cars around the world exactly once, and then it'll be gone. But that's not the worst part. The weight of batteries needed in a vehicle is a function of the gross weight of the vehicle times the distance it has to travel before recharging. For your car, it's a solvable problem. For freight, the problem is not tractable for long distances, because the further freight has to be carried, the heavier the batteries that have to be carried along with it, which leaves less and less room for the freight. There will be no long-haul trucking or shipping using batteries, and short-haul freight is going to get a lot more expensive. Trains can be converted, of course. They're basically already electric. It's just that the generators are fueled by diesel. They're basically, so if they don't carry the energy with them, the battery problem, then they've got to be wired up. And they're doing this in Europe and Japan and other places. I won't go into details, but nobody's yet figured out how to affordably retrofit our 140,000 miles of rail to be electric. Okay, what about hydrogen? A lot of people have talked about hydrogen. Hydrogen can be isolated from water by electrolysis using electricity, stored, transported, and burned in an efficient engine whose only pollutant is water. That's a very nice deal. But hydrogen isn't an energy source. Hydrogen is an energy carrier. The conversion of solar to electricity to hydrogen to locomotion is expensive, and it has an overall efficiency of only about 30%. But transporting and storing hydrogen is where the real problem lies. Hydrogen is very light. It's a very small molecule, much harder to contain than petroleum. And it's explosive. Most of us aren't old enough to remember the Hindenburg. I don't know if anyone in here is old enough to remember the Hindenburg. That was a long time ago. But you all know about it, right? Google it if you don't know about the Hindenburg. Dangers of hydrogen. At a minimum, after conversion to hydrogen-based transportation, moving stuff and people around is likely to be an order of magnitude more expensive than with liquid fuels. And before that is possible, the rate at which electricity is produced from wind and solar has to be increased by a factor of at least 150 over what it is right now, just for transportation. And the entire infrastructure, petroleum-based transportation, has to be replaced by a new electricity-based infrastructure. The cost would be several times any previous industrial initiative in human history. And we have to do it while at the same time reducing our overall energy use. What about biomass? It's really not worth discussing. Its EROI is about 1, and to produce enough liquid fuel to run the transportation sector, we'd have to switch more than 3/4 of available agricultural production to fuel production instead of food. Food, trucks, pick one. So, my friends in the Green Party and other supporters of the Green New Deal, which I'm sure you've all heard about now, are going to be distressed to learn that the situation for grid electricity from renewables isn't a whole lot better. Our civilization is made possible in large part by an electrical system that delivers power on an as-needed basis, 24 hours a day, without interruption. The wind doesn't blow, and the sun doesn't shine on our schedule. So electricity generated from these sources isn't dispatchable. To maintain the grid without fossil fuels, and that's the goal of the Green New Deal, to maintain the grid without fossil fuels means that the generating capacity has to be much higher than the average demand, and the excess has to be stored somehow so that it can be fed back into the grid when the sun isn't shining and the wind isn't blowing. Now, there are all kinds of technologies being explored to do this, but numerous studies show that it increases the cost per watt of dispatchable electricity by an order of magnitude. So pause for a minute and think about your electric bill. In fact, just think about your whole utility bill. So electric, gas, if you use it. Add into it any gas that you buy every month. Add up all those numbers. You got a figure in your mind? Okay, now put a 0 on the end of it. That's your new household budget for energy. But it's actually worse than that. Because embodied energy is in everything we buy. Consider a box of cornflakes. From planting, to growing, to harvesting, to processing, to packaging, to shipping, to point of sale, and finally to your kitchen cupboard, there are energy inputs at every step. At least half are from liquid fuels. On average, a calorie of food produced in our agricultural system requires at least 10 calories of fossil fuel energy to produce it and deliver it to your body. In other words, the energy return on investment of food in this civilization is 1/10. 10 units of energy in to get one unit of energy out. 90% of the energy cost in our food isn't supplied by the food. Considering just the increased cost alone, replacing the fossil fuels in our food system with renewable sources puts the price of food out of reach for almost everyone. And what is true of food is likewise true of every other commodity, from the house you live in to the socks on your feet. So when we say there's no replacing fossil fuels, we don't mean there aren't replacements. There are. There just aren't any for this civilization, because the energy capture strategy that built it has failed. And that brings us to the final point about energy. Can we go backwards? Can we somehow decomplexify or reconfigure our system to not need fossil fuel anymore? After all, we might not want to party like it's 1899, right? But can we get back there if we have to? Or at least to some neo-modern version of the same level of energy consumption? That is, without collapse. Consider that box of cornflakes. The corn that's in it is not the same corn we grew even 40 years ago. Part of the Green Revolution that doubled food production since 1970 was the development of varietals that put most of their metabolic resources, the plant's metabolic resources, into the aspects of the plant that serve our needs. The corn kernels of today's corn are plump and full of sugar, and there's many more ears per acre of corn. To achieve this, the plant uses less of its photosynthetic energy on developing roots, on being disease and pest resistant, being drought resistant, and so on, and directing it instead to the fruiting parts. The benefit is that the plants produce more human edible food. The cost is that without fossil fuel-derived fertilizer, irrigation, pesticide, and herbicides, the plant isn't a viable food crop. It can't stand on its own. Indeed, the entire agricultural system across the planet is dependent on fossil fuels in just this way. Subtract the fossil fuels, and we have to go back to varietals that are much more robust, but which in consequence produce less food. It means widespread famine, even in rich countries. There is a solution in the long term to the agricultural problem: return to small-scale, regenerative, localized food production. Studies show that really is the way to maximize food production, and it has many other benefits, like mitigating climate change. But doing this means reversing generations of previous migration off the land and into the cities. How many of you know how to farm successfully on a small scale, with your own hands and the help of a few animals for machinery? I don't. But I've learned from living on 5 acres of my own these last 10 years that it's not something you just pick up. It's viscerally challenging to forge a living out of the land without engines and chemicals. In a like manner, getting people out of their private steel chariots and living locally means redesigning all of our communities, urban, suburban, and rural, upending all of our current transportation and distribution infrastructure. People just don't know how to live that way. And you're not going to persuade them to try, which means that these changes won't occur until long after the energy to make those changes is gone. In fact, it's mostly already gone. Like any natural ecosystem, the human-made ecosystem of civilization can't be willfully manipulated by its constituent pieces. It can't go backwards. It can't be disciplined. It's more of a wild wood than a walled garden. Our only alternative is to accept that we have already seen the climax stage of this civilization. We're now headed back down the entropy loop. So when are we supposed to start enjoying this? I did promise, right? All right. Well, a person at this point might reasonably ask two things. First, how do we know collapse is really going to happen? I mean, after all, lots of theorizing here, but Dr. Smith, do you really have any evidence of collapse? And secondly, when do you think it's going to happen? Well, these are two questions with one answer. The answer to both questions is the collapse is already underway. And the evidence that this is so is conclusive. Before we examine that evidence, though, we need to stop for a minute and untangle a misconception. We generally use the word economy equivocally to refer to two things as if they were the same thing. These two things are the material economy, what is sometimes called the real economy, on the one hand, and the financial economy on the other hand. The material economy is the production, movement, and use of energy. The energy can be, so to speak, raw in the form of electricity or fuel, but it's also embodied energy in the form of extracted raw materials, processed feedstocks like iron or lumber, agricultural products, machinery, finished goods, and so on. The financial economy is the system of accounting that is used to track and facilitate the materials economy. In an economy that's in balance with its energy flows, the financial economy closely parallels the real economy, and it provides essential services. These include a standardized medium of exchange, mitigation of risk, rational pricing, and so on. One essential service, especially for a growing economy, is capitalization, the provision of excess resources to lay the foundation for increased flows of energy in the real economy. For example, building a new factory, or new roads, or other infrastructure to make growth possible. When complex civilizations collapse, a universal symptom is the financialization of growth. The energy basis of the real economy is in decline and can no longer support growth. Capitalization, what's called liquidity, is still being provisioned by the financial system, but it doesn't translate into real growth. Disparity in financial wealth widens as incomes that depend on the real economy start to shrink in real terms. At the same time, incomes from the financial sector increase exponentially. As speculative bubbles are created and then burst, a ratchet effect ensues in which the wealth disparity grows almost without bound. And I think you can see that that is exactly what is happening. Since 2008, it's interesting, it's widely reported, incomes have actually declined for 90% of Americans. The value of the stock market has tripled. What does that tell you? There's a big disconnect somewhere. And my socialist friends tend to get taken in by this. They look at the Bill Gateses and the Koch brothers and the Jeff Bezoses of the world, and they think that if only they weren't stealing it all, there'd be enough for everybody. But that $150,000 per minute that Jeff Bezos makes isn't exactly the same kind of money that we get in our paychecks. Your paycheck represents rent and food and clothes and gas. His income, millions of times what you and I make, doesn't represent millions of times the material flows. He's not eating 1 million burgers a day. He's not driving 1 million miles. His wealth correlates to power, not to consumption. It's reported that just a dozen or so billionaires are as wealthy as the bottom half of humanity. So if you combine that report with a report that a few dollars a day would fix, world hunger, on Facebook you start to get memes that look like this, right? Well, I'm not against the revolution, but it's a mistake to think that we'll solve world hunger with make-believe monopoly money, and that's what it is. In real terms, the economies of wealthy countries all went into permanent decline between 1970 and 1990, and the decline is accelerating. During this period, the so-called emerging economies, such as China and India, fueled very rapid growth on the basis of massive exploitation of coal, and on demand for manufactured goods from the developed world who used financialization to increase consumer demand, borrowing, even as their own productive capacity was shrinking. But now the emerging economies have also peaked, and the rot of financialization is setting in there as well. But financialization, being essentially a shell game, eventually starts to run out of tricks. The first earthquakes were in the 70s and 80s, the biggest up to now in 2007. Governments responded by inflating their GDP figures. There's a lot of weird stuff in the GDP. You know, it's reported every year. Supposedly we grew 3% last year. They put things in there like imputed rent. If you own your own house and you're not paying mortgage on it, the government imputes how much rent you would pay to yourself for that, and they include that in the GDP. Has nothing to do with the material economy. It's just made up. After 2008, they lowered interest rates to less than zero in real terms. In other words, giving away money for free to banks to lend out. This has kept the financial economy on life support by exploding both public and private debt that represents claims on future production that can never be realized by a shrinking real economy. The obligations that total debt in the United States represents, including household debt, got ahead of myself there. I'll come to that. Including household debt, mortgage debt, student debt, government debt, and such obligations as Social Security and Medicare, all of those together now represent nearly 400% of reported gross domestic product per year, and an even higher multiple of the gross domestic product in the materials economy. Okay, so how many of you have played Jenga? Fun game, right? For those of you who haven't, right, you have this stack of wooden blocks, and you pull pieces out from the bottom and stick them on top. It's a beautiful metaphor for financializing the economy, because it gets higher and higher, but it gets more and more unstable, right? And as you're watching it, you know, as it starts to go back and forth a little bit, and with each new turn, you're just certain it's going to fall, and then it doesn't, and then finally it does, and there's like this sense of relief, right? So that's kind of our metaphor here. When the deleveraging of the financial economy hits and the final collapse ensues, those of us who thought about it are going to breathe a huge sigh of relief, just like the Jenga stack coming down. And the sooner it happens, the greater will be our celebration. Because what if it didn't happen? In a talk I gave here last year, I gave a detailed summary of our impact on the planet. And in the years since, we've learned things that make that summary seem almost optimistic compared to what I'd be telling you if I gave the same talk today. The ecosystem is collapsing. Fisheries, insects, land vertebrates, all these populations are declining at a rapidly accelerating rate. Populations of vertebrates have declined 60% on average since 1970. I mean, that's instantaneous in evolutionary terms. Insect populations have declined by at least 45%. Again, not a steady rate of loss, but accelerating. Pollinators going extinct. Without a functioning ecosystem, there's no physical basis for any level of human civilization. Mineral and water resources are being depleted, again, at an increasing rate. Water stress will soon become extreme in the most populated parts of the world. A third of agricultural land around the world is acutely degraded by industrialized agriculture. At this rate, all of it will be lost before the end of the century. Essential industrial metals will become unavailable, and fossil fuels inaccessible in meaningful quantities at any price. All of which would spell the end of civilization even without climate change. But the science is now crystal clear. We've got at best 10 years to wean ourselves off fossil fuels, or we'll see at least 4 degrees centigrade of additional warming, possibly as soon as 2040, certainly by 2080, with no means whatever to bring the climate back into equilibrium. All that geoengineering stuff, fantasy. It's now generally believed by that point feedback loops will kick in, driving temperatures as much as 10 degrees higher centigrade, no matter what we do. God alone knows if the biosphere will live or die in the aftermath of that event. At a minimum, the remaining ecosystems will collapse, most species will go extinct, and it's questionable whether humanity will survive in any form much beyond the end of the century. And even if it does, there will be no resource base from which to make a new civilization, possibly for millennia. And we can't change course. Knowing full well the consequences, the human system lurches on, helplessly, steadily increasing year by year the release of greenhouse gases into the climate system. If this civilization were to continue another 20 years, it would mean omnicide. It's fortunate indeed that it cannot. So the first task in learning how to enjoy the end of the world is dispensing with delusory hopes. I hope I've helped with that. Neither technology, nor renewable energy, nor political revolution are going to stay this civilization's complexity collapse. Understanding that is step one. Step two is to avoid latching on to predictions of how collapse will play out in the short term. Like the wavering tower in Jenga, you can know for certain it's about to fall, but you can never know beforehand the precise moment or in what direction the tower will tumble. The present human system is much, much too chaotic for those kinds of predictions to be of any use. It must be acknowledged that there are worse outcomes than collapse. The risk of global war, and the use, even if only regionally, of nuclear weapons, is always with us. And it's a risk that will, at least for a time, increase sharply as the collapse unfolds. If that happens, the outcome is no longer collapse, but apocalypse. That outcome is outside the scope of my talk. Regarding collapse, we can certainly identify some eventualities and risks. As a species, by the way, I really like this picture. I think that's supposed to be Manhattan. Just imagine if everybody left Manhattan, in 40 years, what would it look like? Something like that. As a species, we are massively an overshoot of our environment. One thing collapse will necessarily entail is a curtailment of our numbers. How this will come about is not predictable. But we know that if nothing else does it, famine will. And this is not just a risk for the densely populated global south. A study by Cornell University a few years ago found that the agricultural base of New York State, assuming it were optimally farmed, could only feed 21% of its present population. Other possibilities are severe social unrest leading to civil conflicts or interstate wars. As social systems collapse, old epidemics can resurface. For some examples of the kinds of stresses we could see and how they unfold through time, look to the recent history of Syria or the present history of Venezuela. War zone is probably a pretty good analog for the near-term aftermath of a rapid complexity collapse. So, to achieve our goal of enjoying the end of the world, we need a new way of thinking and a new way of being. I really like this meme. The people who come through to the other side and build the new human future will not be the preppers with their bunkers and their ammo boxes. And it will not be the super rich with their $1 million guarded and gated palaces tucked into remote corners of the world. Those people are going to learn a hard lesson. The goal here is not just to survive and make something out of the ruins. That would suck. Our aim is to look towards the human horizon with our shoulders squared, a glint in our eye, and a smile on our lips, ready to build something better than we've left behind. This is not a fantasy. This is how the cycle works. The ecologist C.S. Halling formulated what is called the adaptive cycle of ecosystems. Systems don't just evolve to an optimized and maximized level of complexity and stay there. There's a cycle of creation, destruction, and renewal. Each of these is necessary to the development of life. As dissipative systems grow and become more complex, they also become less adaptable. In the homeostatic climax stage, the embodied energy of the system is rigid, locked in place, unavailable for adaptation and change. When a crisis induces collapse, that embodied energy becomes liquid, available for new patterns of organization, which in turn self-organize and optimize, but in new ways. Think of a giant tree that dominates a patch of forest. When it dies and falls, It opens a space for sunlight to once more penetrate the canopy, and the massive store of nutrients and carbon it had locked up is released for new organisms to use as they harness the newly available sunlight. Similarly, the fall of Rome was not just a loss, but an opportunity that eventually issued forth in a new and patently better civilization. The Dark Ages gave birth to the High Middle Ages, which invented the institutions of the modern world: representative democracy, banking, the university system, and so on. That red star in that image back there, that's the "you are here" marker for humanity. The release phase has begun and is about to send us shooting back down the back loop of the cycle. On a personal level, this has profound implications. As prisoners of commercialized society, we've been steadily robbed of agency in our own lives. Unlike Grandma in the Great Depression, most of us don't know how to do real things: to make, to cultivate, to generate life. We haven't enjoyed the opportunity to fashion our own lives in ways that are meaningful to us. Trapped into indebting ourselves and then selling our labor on the buyer's terms to service that debt, we haven't built community, created or engaged in authentic culture, or felt the luxury of time and space for quiet discovery, for deep reflection, or for familiar communion with our human milieu. Shut out of genuine political participation, we've watched helplessly as our daily contribution of energy is sucked away to purposes we never endorsed. As the collapse unfolds, we can enjoy a new freedom: to be resilient, to adapt, and to have agency to reorganize the elements of our world. We live in interesting times. That's said to be a curse. But the times are going to get a lot more interesting very soon. And I see it as the opportunity we've been waiting for. We will have less, use less, watch less, travel less, but we will do more, say more, see more, give and receive more. This is when we begin to write and to inhabit a new story. Of course, others will finish it. That's the deal. It's a fair deal. Now, I had a lot more that I wanted to say about resilience and adaptation, but as I began to organize the material, I realized that's another talk. But I do want to talk about it. I think, though, rather than me reading at you, it would be better if we talk about it. So after I close my remarks here in a second, I hope that we can engage in some conversation, maybe ask some questions, explore some concerns and details, and help come together around the idea that the future is something that we have to face bravely, but doing so will bring us great rewards. Anyway, that's my prepared remarks. Thank you very much.